Good evening, and welcome to Virtual First Friday at the Custom House Maritime Museum, where we explore our history through presentation and social interaction. Tonight, we welcome Rita Parisi, founder of Waterfall Productions, which was created to present original theatrical productions for the purposes of entertaining and inspiring audiences through her one-woman shows which present characters in a variety of historical contexts from the 18th to the 20th centuries. She is an actress, singer, dancer, producer, and playwright. Tonight, she will be sharing how her subjects are chosen, how she researches her material, including costuming and props, as well as writing and performing each piece. And now, please welcome Rita Parisi.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be with you all here this Friday evening, and I want to thank you for being here with me. I'm going to be chatting about what I do and how I go about doing it, and there will be a Q&A afterwards. So just write down your questions as we go along, and I'll answer them for you at the end. And I just want to give you a little bit of a background about me. I've been acting for 25 years, but I didn't start out as an actor. I started out as a scientist, a molecular biologist, actually, and I worked for St. Elizabeth's Research Department in Leahy for some years. I was researching hepatitis B and hepatitis C. However, I was acting on the side as a hobby, and I was going to auditions, but I never thought I would be able to act as a profession. And during a stage source audition in Boston, I was called back and I earned a place. I actually got a job, a full-time acting job at the Witch Dungeon Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. And I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but they do witch trial reenactments. They do 15 performances a day. And during an average day for me, I would be doing 10 roles, 10 reenactments, and 5 tours for audiences from all over the world. And so I decided at that point that I was going to leave science and actually try to pursue to act professionally. And and I've done some regional theater work. I've done some improv. I've done independent films and costume tour guiding, amongst other things. But for more than a decade, I've basically, for the most part, done my own one-woman shows for about 15 years, 15, maybe 17 years. So what made me decide to get into doing these one-person performances? There were 2 reasons. Lack of work. And my voice teacher, you might know her, Martha Peabody. You see, I had been auditioning a lot and I was not getting many roles. There was always something wrong. I wasn't old enough. I wasn't young enough. I wasn't thin enough. I wasn't fat enough. And if I was considered for any role, there would be 10 other actresses in consideration for it. So I became very frustrated doing that. And I would express my frustration to my voice teacher. And I had been studying voice for some time with her. And she told me that I needed to take control of my career, that I needed to create my own creative content. And that's exactly what I did. I started out creating one-woman shows in the cabaret realm. And that's not because I was a decent singer. And I created 2 shows, actually. One was called A Woman's Prerogative, which was about the choices women can make. And another one called Haunted Cabaret, which was really about one woman's haunted journey from Rotterdam, Holland, to the United States. And I self-produced these shows. I would rent out church basements. I even did some shows during haunted happenings in Salem. But it was exciting and I enjoyed it, but it was not making me money. And I wanted to make money. I wanted to make a living being an actor. So I just turned away from that. I mean, understand by then I was working full time at the dungeon. I was working as an actor. But as luck would have it, in 2004, my husband Michael and I went to the Brimfield Antique Mart. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. And I found a beautiful lingerie gown, a white gown, teak gown from about probably 1908. And when I bought it, and it fit me, I thought to myself, oh, I love this, but where am I going to wear it? So I decided to create a show around this gown. And I have it right here. Let's see if I can show it to you. And it's entirely original and it's antique. It's quite lovely. And I created from this gown a show called Teas in Time, featuring a middle-class woman named Mrs. Gordon from 1908. And through her storytelling, she would reflect her life and times. So all of her stories that you heard, well, they maybe were fictional, the stories, but everything she observed were actual things somebody would see in the year 1908 if they were like walking down Boston or anywhere, you know, they'd see the motor cars and the such. And when you actually see one of my Teas in Time, and I have different themes, you do get a sense of the time and place. I mean, I've had audience members tell me that they feel like they're walking right along Mrs. Gordon as she's going on her journey. And, you know, my research was extensive. I knew very little about the turn of the 20th century. And so I spent over 6 months researching it. I bought ladies' home journals from every month in 1908. And reading them cover to cover, I really understood the life and times, the attitudes, what they were concerned about, the advertisements, the fashions, everything, fashion, etiquette, beauty advice, important issues. And the internet helped me for my research at that time, but not as much as today. There is so much more information today, but back then I did do a lot of, I would read books, I did those periodicals, I would look at newspaper articles, like the New York Times online in their archive section. And it took me about a year, but a year later in May of 2005, I debuted my first show, and it was called 1908 Tea. And I wore that antique dress and I performed at the Stevens Memorial Library in Andover, Mass. And as I said, over the years, I've written new themes for my Teas in Time. I have a Valentine's Day theme, and courtship, and Christmas, and summertime, and the such, and Halloween. Can't forget Halloween. Now, in 2006, I embarked on my second show, on my Gothic Victorian Tales, and I fell into creating that show. The Berwick Historical Society had gotten wind that I had adapted a story from their native daughter, Sarah Orne Jewett, and I had adapted the show for my Haunted Cabaret, which I had done years before. And they asked me if I could present it for them, and I did, and they really enjoyed it. And I thought to myself, well, why don't I just create a larger show and feature 2 other stories from Sarah Orne Jewett, which I did. And then I created the show called Gothic Victorian Tales by Candlelight, Weird Stories from Sarah Orne Jewett. And what I do is I take, in all my Gothic Tales by Candlelight shows, I take short stories from women Gothic writers. I adapt them in such a way where I edit, but I keep as much of the original meaning and substance, the wording, as possible. And I create a theatrical storytelling presentation, not a reading. This is all up here, and I'm actually spewing the words of the pieces of the authors, actually, or authoresses. And I play the narrator, but I also go ahead and play all the characters in the show. And it's a little bit hard to envision. So I'm going to have Sean play a little clip from my Gothic Victorian Tales.
And then at last, I came in sight of an old house. It had once been a comfortable colonial mansion from the last century, but now it gave the impression of dreariness and neglect, poverty and ruin. The barn and outbuildings were leaning this way and that, mossy and warped. Yet, I noticed that the front yard had been carefully tended with blooming roses and clipped boxwood. I went to the side door and gave a knock. Some time elapsed, and then the door opened slowly, and a middle-aged woman stood before me. I was instantly drawn to her The blooming garden was hers, and she was very poor. But a curious hardness drew her face, even as her sweet and womanly eyes watched me. I went to sleep, but it was not a sound sleep. I heard soft footsteps on the stairs, and someone stopped outside my open door as if to listen. And then the gray, shadowy figure of the old man stood within, and his eyes peered about the room. The bed curtains hid me from his view at first, but as he took a step forward, he saw me lying asleep. He bent over me until I felt my hair stir with his breath. One day, a stranger was seen making way through the village. He was tall and had just passed middle age. He was vigorous and well-made, but there was an unusual pallor about his face and his hands, a grayish look. His clothes were somewhat peculiar, as if they had been made in another country, and the color of them and his hair was just a little darker than his face and hands. Some observed that this gray man's eyes had a strange faded look, but that they could flash and be coal black in a moment of rage. Everyone who saw him wondered who he was. The dwelling place was left to the sunshine and to the rain and to the birds that built their nest under the eaves and in the chimney. Sometimes a strolling company of country boys would find themselves near the house on a holiday afternoon. But the more dilapidated the small structure became, the more they became convinced that some uncanny existence possessed this lonely place. The moon had risen, and Cousin Agnes gave me leave to go into the garden for a while. I wandered about, exploring different paths, some of which were arched over with tall lilacs and arbors. Suddenly, I became afraid to be there all alone. All the tall bushes took strange shapes and seemed to come alive. The thorn from a straying branch of a rosebush caught my sleeve maliciously as I turned to hurry away. And then I caught sight of someone in the path just before me. It was Lady Fairy.
Well, that was my Gothic Victorian Tales by Candlelight, and in that actual clip, I was doing mostly the narrator. You know, I was a young child, I was an older woman, and during her travels. Now, my most ambitious project was my one-woman play about Zelda Fitzgerald, who was the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And my original intention was not to write this play, actually. Can everybody hear me? I hope. Okay. I was actually working on writing a play about F. Scott Fitzgerald's female characters. And as I was doing research, I kept hearing a woman's voice. Now it was late at night, I admit, and maybe I was imagining things, but the voice kept telling me, she was whispering in my right ear, and she would say to me, "Do me, everyone always does him." Now, I was baffled by the voice. I paid no attention to, I didn't know who this was. I mean, as I mentioned, it was late at night, and I just dismissed it as nothing. But as I researched more, I saw that many of F. Scott Fitzgerald's female characters were based on his wife, Zelda. And all the while, I kept hearing this woman saying over and over, "Do me, everyone always does him." And the final time, she said something a bit different to me. She said, "Why do an imitation when you can do the original?" Well, an idea occurred to me, and I Googled a picture of Zelda. I wanted to see what she looked like. And up on the screen came a face that looked a lot like mine. And I have actually my program for I Am Zelda, and there's a picture. See if you can see. There's Zelda on the top, and there's me on the bottom. and there is a resemblance. And so I told the voice, Zelda, that I would write a show about her as long as she helped me. And she did help me. And I did write that show. Now, the research for that show was very extensive. It was a year's worth of research. I read multiple biographies. This was one of them. Her most it's a famous one. It's called Zelda from 1970. It was, I think, the first biography ever written about Zelda Fitzgerald. I also read her books. There's a whole, her writings, Zelda's writings are right here. I mean, all of her writings, and her one novella called Save Me the Waltz about her ballet dancing. And I took notebooks of notes. I mean, I think I have 2 or 3, those spiral notebooks full of notes. And as I was writing her play, I tried to emulate her own style of speech. And I wasn't going to start writing, but on the evening of March 10th, I heard a voice here telling me, goes, "You're not done researching yet, but I want you to go start writing this play." And I'm thinking, oh gosh, Zelda, Okay, so I wrote the beginning and I wrote the end. And basically, I wrote the beginning as Zelda, her husband has died a few days before. It's 1939, New Year's Eve, going into 1940. She's in her mother's attic and she's reminiscing. I wrote the beginning and I wrote the end. And then I realized it was March 10th, and that was actually the anniversary of her death. She died the evening of March 10th. She burned to death in a Highland Hospital, which was a mental facility. But as I was writing the show, I really tried to capture her voice. She has a stream of consciousness style, so she'll go from one subject to the next. And I also tried to reflect her mental state. As I mentioned, she had severe mental illness for much of her life. I read her short stories and novels, and it helped me get a good sense of who she was as a person, as an artist. She's a beautiful artist. She's a writer, she's a ballet dancer, a very talented woman. And so my next project after that, it came to me. I mean, I'm always looking for subjects, but they seem to come to me many times. I was looking through a Dover book catalog, and I saw an autobiography called Memoirs of an Arabian Princess from Zanzibar. And it sounded very interesting to me, so I bought it, I read it, and I liked it so much that I decided to adapt this autobiography into a 60-minute show where I played the Arabian princess. And the autobiography was written in 1886, and it highlights her life as a princess and her life as a wife of a German merchant. And it reflects her observation as a woman in both cultures. She talks about growing up in a harem, her father, her mother, being part of a coup to overthrow one of her brothers, her elopement with a German merchant. She talks about slavery even, and it really offers an insight into another culture and how women who go against tradition do always pay a price. And anytime I perform this show, people have loved it. But I have to say the show really doesn't sell well. It's quite disappointing. And I think it's a lot to do with the climate in this country at this time. And I hope that changes, because it's really quite an interesting play. My latest one is called Woman of 76. And I debuted that in September of 2018. And I portray 5 women, both loyalist and patriot, who observed and were involved in the American Revolution. One of the women her name is Prudence Wright. She's a Massachusetts woman. You perhaps know her. She guarded the bridge in Pepperell, Mass. with 30 other women and caught 1 or 2 spies. Another of the women is Mary Catherine Goddard, a printer and postmistress of Baltimore. She printed the first version of the Declaration of Independence with the names of Congress on it, signature of Congress on it. She also put her name on the bottom as the printer, which was a treasonous act. Mary Army, a loyalist whose husband was a patriot, and she wrote about the siege of Newport, Rhode Island, as her husband was at sea shooting upon the island of Newport. The Baroness von Riedel, the wife of Hessian General von Riedel. He was a general at the Battle of Saratoga. She wrote about her experiences as part of that battle and as a POW. and Nancy Morganheart, a Georgian sharpshooter. She's a wild woman. She captured 7 British soldiers on her own, and she held them captive until help came. And I spent well over a year searching for these women's stories. There isn't a lot written about women during the American Revolution, and a lot of it, unfortunately, may not be true, and they're legend. To find my women, I used this book here. There's 3 volumes of this book, The Women of the American Revolution by Elizabeth Fries Elliott. And she, in 1840, she went everywhere around the country searching for women's stories from the Revolution. So she wasn't too far away. She'd been far away, and she gathered up all these stories. And as I was looking for women, if I'd find, say, in another book or on the internet, the name of a woman, I would go look in her book to make sure they were listed there. Because if they were not listed there, they probably were not patriots. At the turn of the last century, a lot of the different women's organizations started kind of making up women because they, the DAR, and I love the DAR, but they were kind of famous for looking for women, any far-fetched stories, so they could actually name themselves. So you have to be careful about that. And I want to mention this book, it only has white women in it. So she didn't even pay any attention to Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic women. And we know these women are also part of the story. I use other primary sources. Mary Ami does have her own, wrote a diary, and so did Frederica, the Baroness, wrote also a diary. So I used those. Those were good primary sources, and I could just take right from them. For Prudence Wright and Hart, I use secondary sources. There was period documentation, newspaper articles, archaeology in some cases, and stories from their children or kin that supported their contributions. Of course, I had to wade through a lot of legends. As I said, I was able to discredit a lot of it because you have to use common sense. You just got to think about the time and if it was realistic that these things happened. As for writing my dialogue for Women of 76, I tried to get a sense of who they were. An example is that Prudence's grandchildren described her in her old age as a woman of medium build with black snapping eyes. Her church records her church records that she rejected the teachings of the Congregational Church, and they threw her out. And though later she was reaffirmed, sources talk about her embroidery and that she could paint, and there are actual examples of her creative work. So from that, I knew here was a woman who was a creative, spirited mother and wife, and that guided me in writing some of her monologue. Sometimes there's no physical description whatsoever, as in the case of Mary Catherine Goddard. We know she existed because she was a postmistress, and the postal museum in DC, she had a stamp put in her name. We know. She wrote letters to George Washington. She had a broadside that she published. So I do get a sense through her words, but I have no idea what the woman looked like whatsoever. I know she didn't get married, and that was it. And she was the hardest person for me to create because she was such a private person. She stayed out of putting her own opinion in her newspapers. Only her editorials betrayed what side she was on, and not many of those survive. So, as I said, she's a very private person. So it was hard. It was hard to kind of wrap myself around her, though I knew her background, her family. She was well educated, smart lady. It was just very hard. And you all have a chance to see the show in July because the Custom House has invited me to present the show, hopefully outside in July, and you just have to stay tuned. Now, I want to talk a little bit about accents. People are very fascinated with accents, and they wonder how I come up with them, how I learn them. Well, I'm fortunate that I have a good ear, and that's from singing. I studied classical voice for 10 years. And I can hear things 1 or 2 times and I've got it in my ear and I can imitate it. And for me, accents are informed by a person's location, where they've grown up, their class, gender, their time period, their culture, of course. Now, for my 1908 Mrs. Gordon, I keep a slight New England accent and I avoid modern slang, obviously, though I love throwing in some of the slang of the period. That's a lot of fun. I try not to make the language too formal, as a lot of people don't understand my gist. If I do, they just don't. I guess because they're not used to hearing that style. Um, but I do try to use more sophisticated words and some interesting phrasing that would have been common, like if I'm wearing my hat and the wind blows it to the side, I would say, "Oh, the wind blew my hat askew," right? Askew. Um, if I see a lady coming from behind a building, and because of her corset and her clothing, I'd say, "Oh, the lady came bustling from behind the building." And then if I saw a motor car, I said, "Young people jaunting in a motor car," stuff like that. Now, with my Gothic tale shows, the dialect is written into the dialogue, especially with Sarah Orne Jewett. You just say the words and the accent, that down east accent. I mean, a lot of her characters were of an upper class or from old families. So you don't hear that a lot of rural quality, but every once in a while you will hear a rural quality in rural Maine quality into some of her characters. And if I don't hear anything, I just try to figure it out for myself. Like, where do they live? What might they have sounded like? Because a lot of times we don't know what people sounded like in the past, right? There was no sound. A lot of times, fortunately, writers and diarists, they wrote phonetically so you could hear it, or at least read and hear what they sounded like. And as for Zelda Fitzgerald, we all know she was a Southern woman. She's from Alabama, and she was born and raised there. Her father was a judge, and at the time, for that class of people, they spoke plantation class Southern, which is no longer spoken. If you think of House of Cards, Frank, he had a plantation class accent. I always call it it's like a Boston accent with a drawl. And there are some variations, but it's just you get a sense. And as I was reading about her, I knew actually, I understood the accent better because I saw a documentary where one of her childhood friends who had never left Montgomery was talking. So I heard exactly, most likely, how Zelda talked as a child. Zelda traveled. She went to New York and Paris, so I'm sure her accent changed. People described her voice as being low, raspy, and she spoke very slowly. So though I have a Southern accent, a plantation class accent with Zelda, I tone it down, except when I'm saying a funny line. And I go very slowly and I enunciate, which I guess is not very common with Alabamans. They talk very, very fast. Now, the Arabian Princess for me was the easiest. You wouldn't think that portraying an Arabic accent would be the easiest. But I found an online speech or class from an Iranian professor, and he was raised in Zanzibar. He speaks both Arabic, Swahili, and English. And I listened to his lecture like 3 times, and I got it. I got it. I knew that the princess spoke Arabic, Swahili, as well as German. So I threw a little bit of German just subconsciously because my mother's a German speaker and I grew up listening to her. And believe it or not, it's just a very interesting accent. Now, I have no way of knowing if she spoke that way, but it's just to give flavor. So when you see this woman, you can see that she is obviously not American. The women of 76, all 5 of them have a different accent or a different cadence of speech. For Prudence, I knew she was from Massachusetts. She's a person who's well educated, farmer class. Her father was an esquire. And I also was reading some of Paul Revere's diary. And he wrote phonetically in his diary. So if you read his diary, you'll get a sense of the cadence. And bye. Anyway, so the cadence. So I picked a lot of the cadence from Paul Revere. Paul Revere wrote everything phonetically. So you knew that he had a nasal accent, very similar to a New England accent today. So with Prudence, I gave her an accent, a Massachusetts accent. I used some of the words such as instead of hollow was holler, instead of coming, a coming, stuff like that. So it just gives a sense. Mary Catherine Goddard, who was one of my other women of 76. She was born in Connecticut and she moved to Baltimore. I happen to be a person of Connecticut. I have a Connecticut accent. I also have a little bit of a Baltimorean accent because of my husband. He's from Baltimore. So I just used my own voice. But I lowered her voice to give her that strong single woman, career woman power. And then there was Mary Almy. She was Rhode Island lady. And they have very similar accents to Connecticut, Long Island. So I just, in her diaries, because I read her diary entries, it's the language. It's very much the language that dictates how I sound. And the Baroness, she's Prussian, not German. And it was hard to find. I had a hard time figuring out how Prussian sounded in the 18th century. So I ended up, the closest I could find was a Danish accent. So, and literally the only way to learn that accent, because it was a hard one for me, is I wrote the monologue phonetically. So I had the accent written into the monologue and I learned it that way. So it was like, instead of room, it'd be room, or frightened, frightened, the T. So there was different little things like that. And Nancy Hart is my Georgian frontiers woman. There's no proof that they had that Southern accent, that Georgian Southern accent in the 18th century. But I knew she was a rural woman. She was not educated. She also swore. So I made her very rural, rough, and she uses some of the slang of the 18th century in describing those British soldiers, things such as beef head and pudding belly, stuff like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the costuming and the staging. I make all my own costumes. The only time I never made a costume was my original dress, and they require a lot of research. As my guide in designing costumes, I consider who the person is, where they live, their class, the time period. And today there are amazing sources for costuming, but when I was doing this, at least at the beginning, there wasn't that many. Now you have the internet, you have Pinterest, which is wonderful. But I used a lot of I use books like this to figure out what to do. And the Edwardian modiste for Mrs. Gordon. And I have a lot of patterns and I adapt the patterns. I have period patterns. And for me, the most important part of the costume, and not everybody will agree with me, is the foundation. You want to look right. You want to have the right shape in your costume. So that means you need to wear a corset. If you're doing historical stuff, you're wearing a corset, you're wearing stays, you're wearing a girdle, you're wearing something. You're wearing petticoats, you're wearing chemises, and that will, hoops in some cases, your stockings, and that gives you a good foundation. And from there, you want to, what I usually do, I go ahead and I choose my fabrics for my costumes. I don't use synthetic fabrics. I have a lot of fabrics up in my room. I've been sewing since I was 14 years old, and I have yards and yards of fabrics. So for all my costumes, because synthetics didn't exist, maybe Zelda had rayon, and later on they had the polyesters, but at least for Mrs. Gordon, and maybe later on they had rayons. But for the most part, I use linens and cottons and silks and woolens, and I use appropriate decorations and embellishments and lace, and it can be vintage, antique, and sometimes I use modern. I do if they have the right look. Shoes for me are very important. Years ago, I bought so many shoes off eBay. They were from the 1980s and the 1990s. They had the right heel, and I bought them and I used them. And on occasion, one time, for women of 76, I made my own shoes. Right, these are it right here. I hope you can see. I had a pair of vintage shoes. I didn't want to spend the money for reproductions, so I actually made it. I cut them, I added the tongue, I added this whole piece, I added the buckle. So it was the first time I ever did it. It came out pretty good. But I enjoy doing that. Now, hairstyle is also important. I have short hair. So I used to have longer hair and I used to style it myself. You can see it in my Gothic Victorian tales. My hair was longer, but my hair is short, so I wig now. And I get much better results. But it's important to make them look natural. I've gotten very good at buying wigs, styling it, adding hair to the wigs. And an appropriate hat can make an outfit. You have gloves, parasols, purses, all those accessories, and jewelry. And jewelry is one of the most important accessories. Well, I think it is one of the most for the Arabian princess. She's Muslim. So she's princess. So she got big earrings and bracelets and anklets. And I was able to buy those things on eBay, and they are actual articles. I mean, they're not made of silver or gold, but they're made of pot metal, but they give the illusion. And they also indicate her status, what she had and what she had lost. So it was important. Um, and for me, every piece that I pick out or create is a reflection of the character, for her personality, her class or educational level, or her time period. Now, I'm going to talk a little. Some of my shows have staging and props, which is along the same line of costumes. Again, I try to envision the atmosphere and the feeling that I want to convey to the audience. And again, place, time period, status play a huge part. And again, because I'm only one person, I try to keep my staging as simple as possible. I actually use an 18th century ladder back chair, an actual antique. I found it in someone's garbage. I was appalled when I saw that. Of course, like they would have a bag of garbage on top, and I threw it to the side. I grabbed it, cleaned it, I polished it up, and it's beautiful. And this style chair would have been typical of all 18th century homes during the Revolution. And it really, that one chair conveys time and place. In Zelda, my Zelda show has over 50 props. Crazy, I know. I bought most of them in eBay. But in one of her stories, she often mentions a pair of automobile salt and pepper shakers that she swiped from a restaurant as a souvenir. And I actually found a pair of 1918 automobile salt and pepper shakers on eBay. They're great. And this prop is used throughout the show to move the storyline along. And that's the long and short of how I create my shows. And a lot of it comes very instinctively. And of course, there's much more than what I'm saying. And I've been doing this so long that it just has become very second nature to me. I give it a thought and I figure out how to do it. And acting for me is as natural as breathing because I've been doing it so long. And now I'm ready to entertain any questions you may have.
All right, I'm gonna allow everybody to unmute if they like. So if you have a question for Rita, feel free to jump in and ask, or you can type something in the chat. Does anyone have any immediate questions? Rita, of all the kind of prompts that you research when you're doing your programs, do you have a favorite?
Favorite prop? Oh gosh. No, I don't. I have so many of them. No, there's no favorite. I suppose, each one is unique and very unique to the particular show. So I don't have a favorite prop. Do you want me to talk about some of my props that I have? I don't have a favorite.
I mean, if you want to talk about the, I got a question here for you from Jack Santos. What character do you find the most difficult to portray? And why?
Zelda Fitzgerald, because I have to go into insanity. She even comes out initially and she's already, you can tell she's a little touched. I mean, she's more or less stable. She's very comedic, very self-deprecating. But she does have a mental breakdown literally on stage, and she comes to the realization through those automobile salt and pepper shakers. She looks at those automobile salt and pepper shakers. She does not remember where she got them from. But by the end she knows. And when she talks about how she got them, then she goes into a monologue, which really ends with her jumping over I guess the dining table is on a terrace that overlooks a deep precipice. And basically she realizes she took these salt and pepper shakers off the table. She saw her husband flirting with Isadora Duncan, and she got so upset she jumped, because the ballerina jumped over the table into the deep precipice down below, and and she's still holding those salt and pepper shakers. So that's a tough one to go, because she's up and down, and she's going in the past, and she's looking towards the future. That is the hardest show, and I have to do a lot. I do a ballet in that. I do a ballet part, and it's very emotionally draining by far, and it's very active. I mean, I'm moving all over the place, opening up the trunk, finding this, talking to Scott, talking to this one. It's all in her mind.
Do you have a favorite period to portray?
I have to say right now, I mean, I would say Edwardian. I love Edwardian. I've done 5 programs in the Edwardian period. Mrs. Gordon has 5 different shows. So I would say that's the one I feel the most comfortable, because I've been doing it so long, and I do know a lot about it. But I'm kind of digging the 18th century and the Revolution right now.
I'm curious, what is it about the Edwardian period that attracts you?
It was the dress. It was this dress right here, this dress, and I needed to. I couldn't wear it. I mean, where was I going to wear it? It's an old dress. It fit me. I needed to do something with that. I created a show.
I don't know. Wearing historical period dress casually is actually becoming more and more popular.
Yeah, I wouldn't though, because I wore it so many times. It has little holes in the bottom. I actually created a replica of this. I put it out and I created a pattern, and I have a replica. I don't wear this anymore. No, not in '05. It was happening, but I created a show, and I was very smitten with the Edwardian period, but they had a lot of problems. But it was an interesting time, especially 1908. I mean, fashion was changing, but also the Model T was going to be introduced in October of that year, and that changed everything. So, I mean, there was a lot of change going on at that time. It fascinated me. Yeah. It was pre-war. People were still enjoying. There had been a recession, a bad recession in 1908 that mirrored 2008, 2008. Same reason. Banks were over lending and the same thing. Yeah. It's a lot. When I did my 2008 and I did my 1908 T in 2008, the parallels were amazing. History does repeat itself.
Unfortunately, yeah. This is Isa. Thank you so much. I wrote a note privately to you, Rita. It's fascinating, the deep research that you've done, and I love it. I do medieval reenactment, and I'm wondering if you belong to any particular groups, and especially Civil War. I have a couple of friends, Sally Mummy and Sally Chetwynd.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know them?
I don't know them. I know them by name only. Yeah, strangely enough, I'm not interested in the Civil War. It's really odd. In medieval times, oh gosh, what an awful time. I would never want to live at that time. It was a horrible time. Yeah, no, it's funny. I'm just drawn to the Edwardian. Now I'm really loving the 18th century. I did the witch trials for many years, 17th century, and I wouldn't go back there. Ugh.
Right.
No way. And the 1920s are interesting. There's a lot going on, but they weren't as gay and great as everybody says they are. There was a lot of problems in the 1920s, and it came from the war, from the pandemic. They had that, pandemic in 1918. They were still doing quarantines in 1920, 1921. Fitzgerald writes about him and Zelda in France, and I think it's 1922, and they're in lockdown, and they don't have any food in the house but booze, so it's pretty funny. But yeah, it's interesting. History is interesting because it just repeats itself, and people really don't change.
Okay. When I do presentations very infrequently, but I realize how annoying it is to be talking to a black box. So the medieval period, yeah, I could understand that being really dark. And not, I mean, some of the folks in the club that I belong to, they only want to do reproductions of clothing from closer to the 16th century, so they can have something really elegant and frilly, because that wouldn't be as typical in the 15th or 14th century. So especially common a more common soul and not the royalty. So yeah, I can understand that. I do, but like 13th century though, but it's a little
Yeah,
boring.
that's going back there. I'm thinking of the Crusades.
Yeah, a lot of scary stuff. Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, but interesting anyway. But thank you so much again.
you're very welcome.
This is Joan. We were
Hi,
talking
Joan.
a little earlier before we all got started, and I was telling you that I admire theater so much, and I've seen some wonderful one-person shows. And you said, or I made the observation that it's a very different art of itself. And maybe you'd like to just tell a few moments about, not only how is it different working as an individual versus in a larger cast, but also what draws you to that and why, because you made some interesting comments. And I wanted you to share a little about that.
Oh, okay. Why do I do one-person shows? Because, I'm not a great collaborator. I get along well with others. I play well with others, but I have a creative vision and I want to fulfill my vision. Now, not saying that if the right person came along, I wouldn't collaborate because it's a lot of work. I do everything from the bottom up. I come up with the concept, I do the research, I create the costumes, I create and then I create the props, a whole thing I create. Sometimes I bring a director in. If I'm stuck in some places, I have a director. Her name is Charlotte Dorr. I bring her in. I says, "Look, Charlotte, I'm stuck, and there's a part of my Zelda. I was stuck. It was the same tone. I go, I can't get out of this. Help me." So I do, and I had actually someone help me with choreography. I do, but I do everything. And even when I have to do all my marketing, I take care of all the paperwork. I drive myself. I haul all my props, everything with me. And I do the show, and I strike the set. I set up, I strike the set, and it's just, and my husband wants to help me. It's really funny. He's retired, but he doesn't do it the way I do it. He throws all the stuff in the suitcase, and when it comes home, things are broken, and I have to. And I'm like, just let me do it myself. So and that's just how I am. So I work best by myself. And not that I couldn't do a play with other people. I mean, I sure could. It would be a nice break. Gee, sitting in the green room with my costume and only have to worry about showing up on stage and do my lines. Gee, I mean, I'm the chief cook and bottle washer. I have to show up. I have to talk to the venue person. I have to do the setup, do the show, and talk to the people afterwards. And they're talking to me as I'm setting up. They're talking to me as I'm striking the set. So yeah, I think it'd be very easy just to do a show. And then I didn't have to worry about anything but show up, go in my costume, and wait to go on. It'd be simple. So, did I answer your question?
Well, I think you said something too, but thank you. I think you also said
What did I say that you
well,
want?
well, I was thinking about how you said something along the lines that when you're working by yourself, it's all about you. And as an artist on stage, that there's no one to help you with you miss a line.
No.
That you have to be so in character that you just start speaking. And in that speaking, you become that character.
Right. I mean, there's no one to give me a cue. I mean, I rely on myself at that point. So you have to know your mindset very well of your character. You have to be your character. You have to know what your character's going to say next. And that way, even if you forget the lines, the words, I forget the words often because I know what she's going to say. I know the story. Just like you're telling a story, you're not going to say it the same way each time. I can at least come up with the words to tell you the story, and probably pretty close to period correct because it's just a part of you by then. And it takes a long time for a show to get into your bones. Mrs. Gordon is in my bones. Arabian Princess is in my bones. I mean, certainly my Gothic tales are in my bones. But Women of 76, it's not my bones. I haven't done that show enough. I was supposed to do that show a lot, but the pandemic hit. So she's still a baby show. And she still isn't really as deep in my bones as I need it to be, but it will happen. But yeah, it's not, yeah, I'm a very independent performer. And it could be because at the beginning, I wanted the play with everyone else. I wanted to be a part of shows with people. And I was kind of, pushed away. And as many people are. And I've become so darn independent that, I don't think I can go back to that, to be honest. And it's not that I have this ego the size of Arizona. I don't. When I perform, it really is about my audience. If they don't enjoy it, I'm not going to do the work anymore. I tell them that if you don't enjoy my work, you don't want to see my work, I'm done. I don't feel what I have to say is so important. Though, as a woman who's 50 plus, I am 50 plus, I feel as we get older as women, we disappear. And I'm still relevant. People still listen to me and they want to hear what I have to say. And that's probably one of the main reasons why I still perform. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else that'd like to turn on their mic and ask a question? We have a few more moments. We'll try to stick to a little bit of an hour. Otherwise.
I think I talked too much. I answered all their questions.
Well, you were the feature, you're supposed to talk.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking it's too long, but I just, I wanted to hit enough of the subjects that, Sean wanted me to talk about a bunch of stuff. So let me, at least let me try to explain. If anybody wants to do a one-person show, I say do it, but it's a lot of work. I mean, if you have something to say or you want to portray this character and you're not getting hired to portray it, you know what? Portray it. If you believe you're that character, your audience will believe you're that character. Do you think I would be cast as Zelda Fitzgerald? Oh, no, you can't be Zelda. Yeah, yet I look like her and I play her very well. My audience believes it, Could I ever do a masterpiece theater? Would I ever be cast in one of those great features, Downton Abbey? No. But hey, I play a character right from that time period. I play, I play 5 different characters for Women of 76. I play a baroness, and I play an Arabian princess, and I play, a shotgun wielding frontierswoman, and people believe me when I'm up there. They don't doubt I'm not that person. I remember doing the Arabian princess, and I was sitting there, and I have jewelry. I have a beautiful blue silk, I don't know. A dress, a shirt. I wear the harem pants, so a long silk shirt, harem pants. I've got these big earrings, and I've got jewelry, and I've got the ankle bracelets, real genuine. And I remember standing up, and a woman afterwards says, "When you stood up, I knew I was in the presence of a princess." And I was like, wow. Yeah.
That's wonderful. You obviously bring the love that you have and willingness to share it, and you have a lot of passion for all the elements of the theater that you perform. So thank you for sharing that tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Sean, for orchestrating the background and the technology pieces. Thank you again.
You're very welcome.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing you in Women of 76 this summer. So everyone who's on here, keep an eye out for that. We will be advertising for that.
Definitely.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you, Rita.
Bye-bye.